And MOOCs is really that author's map, because it's in a semi-formal and non-formal space, and this is obviously formal provision. What's going on in the certification space is particularly interesting, I think, because we're starting to see a whole range of new providers and new forms of provision. So, I don't know if there's a Pearson View Centre in Durban. There certainly is in Cape Town. You know? There will be. If there isn't one yet, mark my words, there will be in the next 2 years. You can send me an email when it opens. Of certification for informal learning, so open badges, which is a way of acknowledging chunks of learning. So this modularization notion again, different sizes and different competencies, and the formal, informal, semi-formal space. And new providers see opportunities for being the ones who will provide some kind of quality control for those new forms of certification. It's very interesting to have a look at what's going on in the MOOC space around certification, and it's quite difficult to keep up with, in fact. So you can do an MOOC and get a certificate of achievement, which kind of looks like a printout. Or you can pay for a verified achievement and get something that looks quite like an actual document that one is more familiar with. You can also just print out your portfolio. So what is starting in place is different levels of legitimacy for types of certification. But if you read the small print, these providers make it very clear that these are not the same as formal certificates in the formal system. Future Learning will ask you to pay £24 for a certificate, a statement of participation, and if you want to go and do a final exam, you can go to a Pearson View Centre, which exists all over the world, and write under exam conditions, and then you'll get a statement of attainment. So these are new forms of certification which I don't think we can afford to simply discard and ignore as irrelevant, when they are offering much more affordable and easier access to education than the current system does. But that's not the focus of my talk today, much as I'd like to get sidetracked by it because it's actually fascinating. I'm going to be talking particularly around what's happening with content. And you will have heard of this move from the age of scarcity to the age of abundance. Of confession. Certainly, technologies enable openness and they enable sharing. So it's very easy to copy a file and share a file ad infinitum. But this doesn't mean that the system is automatically an open system. And I'd like to have a look at the different ways that scholarly and educational content are accessed using these two continuums of the analog and the digital, and the legal and the illegal, because we actually cannot ignore the fact that there's an enormous amount happening in education in general, but I'm talking specifically about education in the legal space. And it's something that we have to engage with. Okay, so we're familiar with the traditional legal analog situation. Books, textbooks, some photocopying, of course, is legal. So that's straightforward. Of course, it's a problem because books in universities are incredibly expensive. And we know that the cost of textbooks is a serious problem for students. And at the moment, libraries buy books for academic communities. Our UCT library and all other libraries will own those books, and they can use them in perpetuity until they collapse. So those are paid for and owned. Students buy textbooks, and there is an active second-hand market. In the illegal space, there's always been a huge amount of legal photocopy, and some of it quite formalized in fact. What about the digital content space, this e-book space, this e-textbook space, which is so interesting? Isn't this the here, easy click, download, you can have it. Isn't that the possibility? So here's an interesting thing that's happening. What we're seeing in the digital content space is a move from products to services. So from the tab file, the binary file, and the control is no longer with the customer when purchased. So you're actually moving from a model from ownership to licensing, and that has profound implications for libraries, for universities, and for learners. The buyer does not own the content. And I love this example where of all books to have a copyright problem, 1984, the book 1984 was removed from Kindles throughout the world one day when Amazon was in a situation where they had a copyright problem. And all those people who believed they bought it and owned it discovered they did not. Because in effect, they are buying the license. We are buying the license. And it's just something so beautiful about that particular example. It's astonishing, isn't it? The buyer doesn't control the Kindle, so here, this is the one where they all just absolutely disappear. Just like that. So your sort of notion of here's an interesting case. You can't get into the content either. So if you want to get a subscription to the New York Times and you think, oh, the postal strike doesn't come even when the post does work, I'm going to spend the money, you are agreeing that only one person may use each account or accounts. So this is what you're paying up for. So the notion of we'll do this collaboratively, or we'll share it, or we'll pass it around, and then we'll give it to a library that is in need, that's over. We're actually closing things down here, rather than opening them up. I suppose we could buy one Kindle. This really counterintuitive. And as I've mentioned, what we find is that we're buying access to the platform, not the content. Digital rights management is an extremely contested area. If they are here today, they will be contesting me for raising this as a concern. It is a vestige of a previous era where publishing, and I used to work in publishing in my previous incarnation, so I know from the inside how publishers think and work. And obviously the idea, especially in commercial publishers who have shareholders, is to make maximum profit. That is the raison d'etre. If you can do that and do something good and contribute to education at the same time, that's a win-win situation. But digital rights is linked to the data. It's really expensive to publish, really expensive to send books from A to B in those containers and shipping rights and customs and so on. And so it would be divided up and you'd get the American rights or the European rights or the Southern African rights or whatever. This is no longer required. So I don't know if any of you ever tried to buy a book online and get a little message that says not available in your area. Please. This is about digital rights management. Of course it's available in your area, just the technology will allow it. It's the basic of a previous way of thinking. And it's the reason that you can't copy your content from one device to another, send it to your friend, etc., etc. It's a very contested area. course, the other interesting thing about the digital content space is the fact that we have new players. So the notion about who is a publisher and who is engaged with content is shifting as technology companies and the like become involved. So there have been some interesting responses to this, which I think are worth engaging with. Dutch libraries going to court to make sure they can lend books, because of course if you buy books, you have a limited number of people you're allowed to have provide access to, which is a big problem and a retrogressive step. And there's a movement to own what you download. Imagine fighting for rights you used to have and now you're losing. Okay. Because, as I mentioned, the thing that technology does is it enables massive sharing at almost zero cost. This is extraordinary. It is surely a wonderful thing. There is a massive discourse out there that tells us this is not a wonderful thing. And this is something we can really talk about a great deal. How does this discourse of stealing enter the space so profoundly? It was not hard to find these images. And you know, it's tied up with quite complex things. So in law, there's the notion of rivalrous goods and non-rivalrous goods. And car is a rivalrous good in the sense of if you take my car, I don't have a car. Non-rivalrous goods, if I teach you a poem, I know the poem and you know the poem. So we both have the poem. And obviously with files online, if I give you the file, you have the file and I have the file, we both have. This is a good thing. And those of you interested in the history of copyright, the history of copyright is premised on sharing of knowledge as the premise. And the notion was, in the first instance, that authors were allowed a short period, and of course the big companies are making that longer and longer as much as they can, a short period for economic possibilities, but the intention was always that knowledge should be in the public domain. That's where the original idea came from. So this is a very interesting and highly contested space. We have done research with students about whether or not they are involved in file sharing and whether or not they're downloading textbooks from pirate sites like LibGen. And of course they are. So rubber proofs on conditions of complete anonymity. We don't know the students' names. And that they have about this. They would like to attribute, but they can't because they got the material that they got from is This is the landscape in which open content is happening and to be found. And here I'm talking about all types of open content. And what do I mean by open content? Free to the user, available under an open license or public domain. Public domain meaning it's out of that copyright period. And I have to tell you something. If you leave here with one message from me, you have to engage with copyright. There is no escape. If you're going to work in the space, you have to get to grips with copyright. It's the sort of thing everyone goes, oh, it's like statistics. I hate it. I can't do it. Somebody else must do it. You must. And it's particularly relevant if you're interested in the open content space. I hate to say it. Okay, so open content is part of a whole plethora of opens that you are hearing about every which way you turn in horror. But it doesn't come from nowhere. And Prof. Bauer, when you were talking earlier about open access for development, I thought of this fantastic talk, the presentation that Matthew Smith gave, from which the slide comes on the open development hypothesis, where he really thinks through what open access means for development in a whole range of places. And he points out that this issue of openness has been around for a long time. This is not anything new. It started with the notion of open society. Popper's been talking about the notion of open government, started in the 1950s. We've had open source software under GNU licenses since the 1950s. And OERs, which I'll be talking about more, have been around since 2002. So this is actually not new. What is new is the technology-enabled side of things. Those affordances I mentioned at the beginning, those are the things that's really, it's the bringing together. It's that metaphor of the perfect storm, all of these things coming together at the same time. And here we have all of these issues around gratis, which is free to view, but not necessarily to use, the notions of freedom, collaboration, transparency. One of the most interesting aspects of openness online, and I can tell you some fascinating anecdotes about this in our own experiences since we've put a whole lot of material online, what's happened around transparency and public participation. These are all interests attached to the open agenda. Okay, but I now know that people hear open, and they hear online, and they hear MOOCs, and all of those words get muddled. So I'm going to do a quick run through of the differences in different aspects of open content, online courses, and MOOCs. Okay, the first thing, the cost to the user. Open content is free. Online courses, simply delivered online, have fees, and MOOCs have no fees. Except that edX has just completely ruined my table because they've just introduced fees for certain edX series last week. But generally, it is fair to say that MOOCs don't have fees. Similarly, open content has no entry requirement. Anybody can access them and use them. And online courses are just courses. They're like any other courses. You have to have the normal kinds of entry requirements that you can have. MOOCs, that's where they open. That is the reference to open. That is it. They open for inference. So anyone can do them. Of course, as soon as I say that, I can think of an exception, but 99.9% of the time, MOOCs are for anyone. There is no process of selection. And that's, of course, one of the reasons that the dropout rate is so high, because you can try them, etc. But that's what open refers to in MOOC. All the rest is contested and, in fact, far from open. And we can look closely at MOOCs and see how not open they really are. But they are open in that regard. Okay, the scale with open content, I'm going to be looking some more examples. They are modular. They go from tiny. So in our experience, with our open content repository, one of the most highly downloaded objects is a poster. So it's a single image to entire courses on MOOCs. Online courses are not large. They're limited by resources available for support and assessment, and MOOCs are as big as they can be because of savings on the support and attempts to insert some forms of adapted learning. What about the lecturer role? Well, the lecturer is really important in open content, good quality open education resources. The lecturer in online courses is responsible for curriculum design and support in the usual way. In MOOCs, the lecturer may play a very small role. They might be the designer, they might be the talking head, but they are certainly unlikely to be there available to the students. Copyright is a central issue. Open content is legally open. That's what's so fantastic about it. It's legally open. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions about open content and open access that I have encountered. People think you're giving away your copyright. It is the opposite. You are keeping your copyright. When you're giving away your copyright is when you publish in academic journals. That's when you give away your copyright. So those of you who think that open access doesn't support academic freedom are getting it the wrong way around. Open access keeps your copyright instead of giving it away and gives the publishers the right to publish, but you keep the copyright. Online courses, well, some of them are proprietary and some of them are open. The interesting thing about MOOCs is that for many, access might be open, but for many, the course materials might be purchased. So you will have cases where the course materials are available freely for the duration of the course, but if you want them afterwards, they disappear into that sort of space in the cloud where these kinds of things go. And you have to go and buy the ebook or the book in the normal sort of way. The other interesting thing about MOOCs is that most MOOCs platforms own the user-generated content that we provide. So those, if you go and read the fine print, and I recommend it, those points about we can do whatever we like with whatever you say. So if you provide case examples in those forums of your local contents, case histories, and so on, some MOOC providers can sell them if they want to. They are not open in this instance. Providers, well, open content is usually public institutions. It's not normally in the interest of private bodies to make open content available, although there's some interesting things going on in companies like Elsevier, which are moving into text mining and other services. Online courses have traditionally been in the distance education provider space. And of course, what's so interesting about MOOCs has been this residential university private company partnership relationship that's come into being. And then quality assurance, well, they vary. I know when we talk a little bit more about open education resources, you're going to ask me, how do we know if they're decent quality? And I will say to you, how do you know that the materials that are made available to your paying students are of decent quality? Okay, so open access. Open access, Peter Stuber, for those of you interested in reading more, is the person to read. Digital, online, free of charge, free of most copyright and licensing restrictions, not of licensing, but of licensing restrictions. And it's interesting that this Spark, which is a very fantastic advocacy organization, talks about open access as the free and online availability of research articles. So you do need to remember that for many people, open access refers to research articles. There is also a push generally at the moment for that to refer to a broader scope of formats and types. But when you're having a conversation about open access, make sure that you have agreed with the person you're talking to, whether they're only talking about research articles, as in this case, or whether they're talking more broadly. There is an argument in African universities for a much broader understanding, given the types of work and the types of outputs that are produced. You will drown if you're looking for engagement with open access. I'm just going to recommend 2 readings and then move on to open education resources. So the one is the policy guidelines. Elma Swan has been working in this space for an incredibly long time and is sensible, knowledgeable, and practical. And she's the one who put together the UNESCO guidelines. So I recommend those. And then I'm going to, I must confess, recommend a paper that I co-wrote with this colleague on open access in South Africa, which is in the current issue of the South African Journal of Science, specifically aimed at scientists, at researchers who are not already engaged in the open access space. And what we did in this paper is we analyzed the top 20 journals in which UCT academics publish. So half of the journal articles are in 20 journals. And we had a look at them to see how many of them were open access. Anybody want to guess? Very interesting. So we then looked at the costs of those, whether or not they charged article processing charges, of which one did. The South African Journal of Science is fully open access, does not charge article processing charges. Looked at the different models, looked at how many of the proprietary and hybrid journals allowed for green open access, which is putting things in the repository. I think it was 19 out of 20 did. So we used this as an opportunity to reflect on the issues, which is why we call it a case study in reflections, because there was so much that arose out of this particular example that, in fact, we were asked to write it up so that others might be able to think about those issues. And I hope people will find that useful. And now I'm going to talk about open education resources. Finally, Graham, as requested. Okay, and UNESCO's definition, I think, is pretty good. It's the one I prefer. Any type of educational materials that are in the public domain or introduced with an open license. The nature of these open materials means that anyone can legally and freely copy, use, adapt, and reshare them. Okay. And once again, always some fantastic people. David Wiley is the person in the open education resources space to read, follow his blog, and so on. And he, interesting, that opening line talks about copyrightable work. And he makes the point that not to confuse with open source software, it's not actually the same. I mean, it does have some premises, but it doesn't tend to use the same licensing. And he talks about the R's. And he's the one who hear people talking about the 4 R's or the 5 R's. He's the one who introduced them. The right to retain, so to make, own and control copies. So this business we were talking about earlier, of actually keeping what you've got. To reuse in different ways, different formats. To revise, so here we're talking about adapting in some sort of different way. To remix, to take the original and add something else to it, so you're actually changing the content itself. It no longer is a version of it, it's actually becoming a mixture of things. And then to redistribute, to make those different versions available. And this is where my point about copyright and open licensing is absolutely critical. And Graham and I met last week at a Council for Higher Education talk where somebody spoke for a long time about copyright. I think it gave a lot of people a fright because there's so many complex issues in the open licensing space as well. I mean, I think people hope that it will all go away if you're engaging with open education resources, and it doesn't. So just to remind you, it's a set of exclusive rights granted by the law of jurisdiction to the author or the creator of an original work, including the right to copy, distribute, and adapt the work. That's what copyright means. And that remains the case in the open content space. Creative Commons licenses are the most common, and they range from most restrictive to the most accommodating. So there's 6 kinds, and in my experience, and I'm sure Denise will talk about this too, when you offer academics Creative Commons license, they always choose the most restrictive, just to start with. So yes, I'm going to keep my copyright, and you can use it. If you can't change it anyway, you definitely can't commercialize it, but you can use it. So what it's doing is all Creative Commons licenses require attribution, which of course is not what happens in the general space to date. And just ask yourselves, those slides that you put together for the last thing you did, how many of them did you attribute those images? You don't. I mean, this is the interesting thing about this Creative Commons sphere, is it's actually put attribution back onto the table, which is a good thing, because it's the one thing that creators want. Above all else is acknowledgement that they created that work, whatever it is, art or text or whatever. So there's always attribution. That one, in fact, there isn't a license that doesn't allow for attribution at the moment. I suspect there might be if you don't want attribution. So this presentation that I've made available has a Creative Commons license on it, and you are free to share, adapt for any use at all, including commercial, as long as you attribute that I've done this in the context in which I've done it. That's what that means. The commercial one is quite an interesting one, because if you don't put that on, if you want to print out my slides and give them to your students and cover the cost of printing, if I didn't have that commercial inclusion, you wouldn't be able to cover your costs of printing legally. So everyone always thinks, oh, you're going to make lots of money. Let me tell you, it's not going to happen. People do not make lots of money from publishing. I can tell you from my publishing days, if you want to make lots of money, you might, if you do primary school maths and English, that's about it. For the rest, people don't make money from publishing. This is not actually true, or if you will, the Smith. But for the rest, you might as well actually include that commercial license, so that those who want to print and cover the cost of printing, and the kinds of people who want to print my stuff, I'm happy for them to use it. So it tends to be the most accommodating for good reason. Okay, so open content, as I mentioned, it ranges from small chunks of whole courses. It might include some involved pedagogy. It's about abundance, not scarcity. And it's obviously standalone. So I'm just going to give you a run through of some examples from the work that we've collected at UCT. This poster, one of the most downloaded examples, as I mentioned. And we've done some work on mapping the Khan Academy videos to the South African curriculum. That's a kind of meta-level contribution. Architecture projects, student projects. Animations. Blog posts. What happens to blog posts? Librarians shiver. They disappear. You can actually keep versions of blog posts for preservation purposes. And obviously journal articles. This is a South African Journal of Education. It's an open access journal, another one, in which I published a paper earlier this year. You can make that available. You could also make a post-print available. This is another journal article, which I think was in an Elsevier or a Routledge publication, and then out the post-prints. They wouldn't allow the final version of record. Reports, whole courses. The physics discipline is a really interesting discipline. Prof. Bauer mentioned them earlier. They've got an archive for a long time. At UCT, they're also the one who've been putting all of their course materials up for years. And you can get all the lecture slides, and you can get the actual lectures in an age of lecture recording. So your students here can have access to all of the physics recordings and slides from UCT if you want them. And they might be more useful to you than Yale's would be in terms of local context, for example. MIT, whole courses, Sailor, whole courses, And here's an interesting example, having told you all the good things about MOOC platforms, here's an interesting example of a MOOC platform in Europe, which actually sets out to make its materials, OERs, and the whole MOOCs available under open licenses. Open Up Edu, which is a European consortium, and I just noticed when I was preparing this the other day that they've been working with Nigeria to make their materials available as OERs and eventually as MOOCs. So it is possible. And then of course open textbooks, which is the obvious space to be investing in, because textbooks are so expensive. And if one can make loads and loads of material available legally open and allow for adaptation and remixing, one has a body of legal content to work with, and all you have to do is tweak it for your own purposes. The question everyone always asks is, how do we know they are any good? Well, the University of Minnesota has got an open textbook library where they pay academics to review those textbooks, because it's still a cost saving. They pay $500 a textbook, sounds pretty good, and you get really good reviews. So you actually get a sense of what thinks of the value. Okay, why on earth does this all matter? This is where, at the moment where you get tired of hearing my voice and I put a video on.
A few years ago, a professor taught a climate change course reaching about 100 students per semester. One day he thought,
if I could upload this course online, would my 100 students have access to it, but others as well?
So he did. And this is what happened.
Anna sent the course's content across the country to Alex, who was studying climate change.
Alex found it so interesting that he forwarded a copy to his friend Lulu in Africa.
Lulu was developing peer-to-peer courses with Philip, so they remixed the content with other resources and created a new course about the impacts of climate change in Africa.
Alan, a participant in the course, shared the content with Gabby, who was studying environmental policy in Latin America.
Gabby brought the content to her class, and together they translated it into Spanish. After that, Gabby's professor shared it with his other classes.
Myra, another student, shared the content with her father, passed it on to his colleagues.
Gabby's professor also forwarded the content to David, a colleague in the UK who was researching climate change. He updated some of the data, adapted it to his study, and published an article in Open Journal. Researchers from all over the world were able to read the article.
David sent the updated content back to the original professor. By then, his course had reached so many more people than his 100 students.
Years later, many schools began to follow the example and open access to their content.
Governments began promoting the use of open textbooks, and students began saving money on books.
Other innovative universities began to open access to entire courses, making them available to participants from all around the world. These are open educational resources, teaching, learning, research resources that can be reused, redistributed, remixed, and revised.
Open educational resources are accessible to everyone: learners, teachers, researchers, parents, workers, citizens, to you.
This is open education, knowledge as a public good.
Everyone has the right to be educated, yet only a few have access to school.
Open educational resources increase access to, improve quality of, and reduce costs of education.
Sharing knowledge is important.
Now you know, open educational resources give everyone the opportunity to learn.
And what's lovely about it is it was originally done in Spanish. You can get it in a number of different languages because it's made available as a video under a Creative Commons license, so we can translate it into whichever languages we would like to. I think it makes the point very beautifully in 3 minutes. I've lost my view, but never mind. Okay, so why do this? It's efficient. It saves time and it saves money. If you start off with something legally open and you adapt it, of course it's going to be cheaper. It's legal. So all of this discourse around illegality, you don't have to deal with that because people have provided permission. And it increases quality. You've all heard of the MIT OpenCourseWare initiative, the one that started it. When they've done numerous surveys and investigations into its impact, the major impact of that initiative has been increased quality of teaching resources for MIT students. Because the process of putting those resources online made people less prepared to have scruffy materials given to a group of students in their own classes. This is a good thing. And it can enable new pedagogical practices. So this flipped classroom notion of let them watch the videos in their own time and we'll spend the classroom time different is quite prevalent. Why contribute open content? Now this is a different matter. This is something where people get very anxious. Oh no, not me. And what I find most curious is that the better the teacher, the more anxious they get. Which is quite funny. But it saves money, obviously. And for us in our context, it means that students get more access to more relevant resources. It's a public good. I mean, we are public universities. We're supposed to be doing education for a public good. And in our own case, I will ask here, how many people here have contributed to Wikipedia? 1, 2. Everyone in this room should be contributing to Wikipedia. Wikipedia is the #1 hit of Google searches. It is the place where people go. Doctors are forming consortia to contribute medical knowledge to Wikipedia. We should all be contributing to Wikipedia. For all that we do that thing of, oh, well, our students shouldn't be, our students are. So let's make sure that the content in there is decent content. And most importantly, that the references are good references, because that's actually where students use Wikipedia the most. So, I mean, if we're talking about a kind of local project to adjust some of the politics around knowledge production and dissemination, I would suggest start with Wikipedia. And we do have a declaration, the Paris Declaration in 2012, which encourages open licensing of educational material produced with public funds. If our government had to actually take that a little step further, it might require that. I don't know what the, do you know what you would need to when you sign your contract to join DUT? Do you own your teaching resources, or does the university? So what happens when the university decides, Prof. Bauer's left the room, so I can't ask him. What if he decides at level of principle to take the Paris Declaration forward and make all teaching resources available as open education resources? What would the consequences be? He can. Something to think about. And we know that the policy documents already encourage the use of open education resources. So the new distance education document of 2014 encourages the use of OER. It states very clearly that teaching development grants will be used for the support of OERs. The South African White Paper encourages the use of OERs. It's actually in our policy frameworks already. And we do have examples in other parts of the world where state and government have made the decision, and here's one, a province in Canada, to offer students free online courses for the 14 most popular post-secondary courses. Why aren't we doing this? There are a number of consortia. I would suggest going to look at Open Education, the Open Education Consortium. And this is one slide showing the massive increase of visits over time as people get to know about these kinds of consortia. How do you do this? Well, I could do an entire thing on how you do this. What is going to send you to some future learn offering on how to create open education resources. Very systematic. The fabulous thing about Future Learn is they've got this experience with the Open University in distance materials. So that's a really good resource. But the question that people ask, but how do you find them? They are there. How do you find them? And it's something librarians in particular really need help doing. Once again, I'm going to send you to a resource one of my colleagues put together, Finding Openness, Shiham Sheikh. If you go to the Open UCT report, I'm sorry, I forgot the URL. It is a presentation of site after site after site. And of course, you can search Google by Creative Commons license. You can search, all my images come from Flickr. Searching by Creative Commons licenses there's lots of stuff, you know how. But I do want to caution that openness is not an end in itself. I would like to caution about kind of evangelism. I think one must always say to oneself, does it add value? What is the value? Sometimes it might not add value. Sometimes it's infringing on privacy. For students, it might cause embarrassment. I mean, I think that one has to take a little bit of a more nuanced approach to the open agenda. It's not a binary. It's not like open is good and more open is better and closed is bad. It's a much more complex environment. And my colleague Cheryl Hodgkinson has done some excellent work on ways of thinking about the continua in the open education process. So she breaks down, this is one slide again from a much longer presentation where she breaks down all the processes involved in making open education resources and then maps the continua on the technical scale, the legal scale, cultural, pedagogical, and financial. So you can actually map how open or closed different aspects of the process are. Here's one example where I mapped looking at a MOOC, and you can see you might have learning resources very much on the open scale, but the user-generated resources being closed, the platform being open, so if you're using Moodle, it's going to be open, but the course itself might be somewhere in the middle. So that's the kind of map that you can develop, which I think is pretty useful. There's an enormous amount of research needed in the space, and particularly, I'll show you this now. Particularly, we need research about open education resources in our context. If you do start looking for research, fantastic research, but it's from the global north. It's based, it's just, it's that kind of material. So I'll just quickly tell you a little bit about what we were doing at Open UCT. I have to tell you, sort of couldn't not tell you, because I'm very proud of some of the choices that we made. First of all, before you get too excited and envious about all the work we've done, I must tell you that this slide maps all the soft funded projects that we have engaged with to do all the open work at UCT. So this has come through soft funding. It hasn't, you know, a lot of this work has been considered quite on the edge. It hasn't become mainstreamed until now, where in 2015, this work is moving into the library, which we're very, very excited because it means it's going to be mainstreamed. And my center, the Center for Innovation in Learning and Teaching, will work with the library on open education resources, but the activities that are involved in producing and finding them will be taken up by the library. We've signed the various declarations. We've also got an open access policy that supports open education resources and open research. And it encourages all forms of content to be made available. So this, if you ask me at any time about the politics of getting this through the various bodies, I'll share some of that with you. And in the traditional way, we require academics to deposit journal articles, and we require students to deposit their theses and dissertations before they can graduate. Our launch was 31st of July, it's very new. The thing I want to show you that was unusual is that we have combined research and education resources in our repository on the basis that a scholar produces research and teaches about their research, and that you would be interested in their public lectures, their newspaper articles, their research articles, their teaching resources, and that you would like to find them all as somebody who's interested in a body of work by a particular academic. So you can search for all content by a particular author, but you can search by research only, and you can search by teaching and learning only as well, if that's your particular area. And I am about to finish off. Our preliminary stats since July show that South African economic issues are the most viewed, and quantitative methods for economics are the most downloaded, which sounds like a teaching resource, doesn't it? And then I do have to mention this Global South Research Project that we are hosting, that's looking at open education resources right across the Global South, because as I mentioned, this is an area where there really hasn't been very much to date. So 2 days time, there will be, because it's a very ambitious project. In conclusion, I suggest that you go back to Matthew Smith, who I referred to earlier, because he does a fabulous job of mapping out the costs and values of open education resources. I really did consider before Graham started saying, talk about this and remember that, of just bringing this slide, because we could have spent an hour just analyzing this map that he's spent a lot of time and thought, looking at the costs and the values, the incentives, the intermediaries. It's not simple. If you're starting on this journey, it is a complex journey. But I mean, obviously, I believe quite profoundly that it's worth it. So in this time of incredible shifting sands, I'm very happy to be sharing this journey with you. Thanks very much.
I'm going to take at least 3 questions at this point in time for Laura to engage. So any questions? Have we got a microphone to go into this one? Okay. Any questions that you'd like to pose to Laura at this point? Okay, we'll take 3 questions and then Laura will answer.
Thanks very much for a great presentation. I'm just interested, with all this open collaboration and things, are there people, is there collaboration on open in South Africa?